Thank you for coming all the way from Hong Kong.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Loic and Geraldine, for inviting me. It is a great pleasure being here. I was here first time 11 years ago when I think it was still called LeBlog. And as probably one of the few attendants that is actually not from Europe or the Bay Area, I thought I'd introduce a little bit about Asia to you and explain to you a little bit about some of the opportunities that the region has to offer for many of the entrepreneurs in this room and beyond. So first, let me talk about the region at large. I won't be able to cover all of it, obviously. There's over 4 billion people in Asia, 1.3 billion internet users, of which more than half, almost half of the global internet users are in the region. And China, Japan, and South Korea is almost 800 million of that. So I'll be focusing mostly on that region. But before, I would like to take you back in time a little, to go a little bit back in time to explain some of the history, which will hopefully elaborate on some of the opportunities that are there. First, I want to talk about almost over 100 years ago, over a century ago, the first sort of Asian immigrants started moving to America because of all the wars and troubles that were in China and of course in Japan and other places in the world, in Asia. And as they moved there, they immigrated and brought with them not just basically working in those areas for a better life, but they brought with them also their culture and assimilated themselves into the local environment in America. Not just learning the language, but also trying to maintain their Chinese identities. And of course, the Chinese railroad workers moved to California, and some of you already know that story. But during that phase, they started adapting themselves. And of course, one of those adaptations is the fortune cookie, which is in fact not Chinese at all. If you go to give a fortune cookie to someone in China, they're like, that's weird. Why would anyone put a piece of paper inside a cookie? However, the reason why I like this story is, and it's debated whether it was created by a Japanese or a Chinese person almost 100 years ago, is because it's an example of an evolution, where immigrants coming from one place across the ocean were basically adapting themselves with product that a local market might like. And of course, as time went on, they adapted, and then they actually tried to become more authentic. And of course, today, Chinese cuisine or Japanese food is amongst the most popular foods in the world, and usually typically in top 5 of American palates, for instance. And the global sort of, call it Asian infiltration over the last century or so has been widespread, to the point where there are more Chinese, overseas Chinese in the world than there are French in France. And of course, what's interesting about that is that as they bring their culture and export that, whether it's through Chinatown, whether it's through their culture or through the media that they represent, they actually slowly are turning more and more of the local people in America or in France or in the UK slightly more Asian by giving them their Asian culture and their Asian taste. Now, they, of course, or through many generations, become Western in their own way. And what happens is they go and study in the local universities. They get Western values. They learn about sort of Western culture, absorb Western film and media, and then they go back. They go back to Asia. And in China, we call those people sea turtles because they go all the way to across the ocean to another country, and then they come back. And the sea turtles are very well-paid people. People in China really want them because they have international know-how and they know basically new angles in terms of how to develop business and so forth. But what they, of course, bring back is not only know-how how to build stuff for the Chinese market. They also bring back Western culture. And of course, the Western culture isn't necessarily always in the form of fast food, although that was one of the very first big successful exports into Asia, and especially in China and elsewhere. And of course, with that, with those changes, they're delivering a kind of mashup, actually, a kind of culture mashup, where it's not really completely Chinese and it's not really completely American. In reality, there's an adaptation and a fusion that happens over the many years. And the reason I wanted to share this with you at start is because many Western companies in particular fear the Asian market. They look at Asia and say, oh, it's culturally too difficult, it's really hard to penetrate that market, I don't understand it, I don't speak the language. But in reality, especially in recent times, in fact, both in Asia, especially if you look at China, is becoming more Western. And in fact, the West is becoming more Asian because of the food and the culture and the media. And this is also the reason why it's possible for cloning to work. Right? And this is, of course, a famous example where, and we're back pre-mobile days. Ren was a very successful social network in China and essentially just copied Facebook exactly. But what was interesting is that when they launched this was a huge success and it became the largest web-based social network in China. However, the similar copycat models 15 years earlier that were trying to basically emulate sort of the Yahoos and the early day forms of Amazon back in the day, those did not work. And they didn't work because many of the similarities weren't there. The cultural connections weren't there. And of course, some of the infrastructure wasn't there as well. But now, basically taking something from the West and just bringing it into Asia with some adaptation works a lot better. And of course, this is famous. This is what most Western companies think of in terms of a Chinese strategy, which is sell into China because there's a billion of them, right? And local Chinese people are also very enterprising to the extent where they create fake Apple stores, so they're basically able to deliver that sort of that demand that is in China. And of course, we all know that China is one of the fastest growth markets for Apple. But this is not just true for sort of goods like Apple. It's true for luxury goods. The Louis Vuittons. It's true for red wine, and it's also true for games. Games that are developed in the West, not with a mindset to actually sell in China, like the Temple Runs or the Subway Surfers of the world, actually are successful in Asia as well. Whereas perhaps 10 years ago, a game that was designed not for an Asian market might not have succeeded. Today, it actually does. Now, the copycat model isn't the only thing that works in China, because of course, things are changing as well. And if you look at Asia as a whole, from the top, and again, patents filing isn't the exact measure of innovation, it's only one indicator. However, of the top 5 countries that are delivering patents in 2013, 3 of them were in Asia: Japan, China, and South Korea. And that is something of an indicator of where innovation is headed in China and in Asia. And of course, some early examples of the reverse is already happening. If you look at video games as an industry, if you look at whether it's a Nintendo or a Sony, or if you look at basically some of the new smartphones that are coming out, or Xiaomi in China, or of course all the laptops that you're using with some of the new stuff that's inside, all of these are actually designed and created now in Asia for a global market, and you're using them, and in fact, there's no Western example. And the other form of innovation is the one that we don't see, particularly in China, because of all of the progress they've made in manufacturing and supply and logistics. Because Kickstarter, as a business model, which is, I guess, as a Western business model, wouldn't have been possible if Chinese supply chain and logistics was innovated to where it is today, where it's able to actually make products and items in small quantities with the materials that were needed and taking care of all of that. If China didn't innovate to that point in its manufacturing process, many of Kickstarter's or Indiegogo projects that you're buying wouldn't actually be able to be made. Now, of course, China also has their own crazy shit, you could say. In this case, these are smart chopsticks. Originally started as a April Fool's joke, but then they got so much demand from China that Baidu decided we're going to go ahead and try and actually manufacture these. And the smart chopsticks is a uniquely Chinese proposition that, however, might have the potential to go outside. And the reason why is because food safety and health in China is a big deal because of all the food scandals that are out there. You don't know if it's actually a real egg. They don't know if it's actually real oil. Is it real soy sauce? They don't know, right? And so they need a device like this where they can actually eat and say, oh, this is real. Oh, now I can have it, right? However, it doesn't take much imagination to figure out where this kind of technology could be used in other areas not related necessarily to food health and safety outside of China. So innovation can also move out. Now, some of the opportunities that I think is interesting for everyone in this room is partially because the domestic landscape in China is ultra competitive. It is not as simple as, well, here's the Amazon of China and here's the Google of China and that's it. Each of them are competing with each other in almost all sectors of business. Just to give you an example, China alone has over 170 listed companies around the world that have a valuation of over $1 billion US. 170. And each of them are in multi-competing segments. Alibaba is where Tencent is where Alibaba is, Baidu is trying to kind of do everything as well. And of course, how do you compete in that environment? You have to innovate. So innovation becomes necessary to survive in your own domestic market. And the opportunity for some people here is to sell, perhaps, products and services to a Chinese market that is hungry for it. It used to be that when you were actually trying to enter the Chinese market, you were at the whim of a Chinese company that said, well, you want to enter China? You've got to talk to me, no choice. But things have changed a little. If you have a unique proposition or an interesting innovation, they will bid for you. This is what's changed. The other thing, of course, is that many of the Chinese companies are also looking to expand overseas because the local marketplace has become so competitive that they need to look at new markets, which you can definitely see in areas, for instance, like online games. An example of this competitiveness is, for instance, in the case of app distribution, which is a business that we're in. If you are an app developer, you typically make a product for Google and for Apple and maybe Amazon. That's your marketplace. And then maybe you do some advertising. However, in China, you've got to work with at least 10 different app stores. And if you want to have proper reach, probably 20 or maybe even 30 different app stores. And on one hand, that kind of fragmentation might be a nightmare for a developer. It's also an opportunity, because each of those slightly smaller app stores are much more willing to work with you to bring your product to their marketplace and to support you in the process, and can actually support a better ecosystem because it's not as monopolized. And of course, there's been multiple investments already made, mostly from Israeli or Silicon Valley-based companies of Asian companies, whether it's Rakuten expanding and buying companies overseas, or Tencent and Alibaba or Nexon making all sorts of acquisitions. And this is obviously just a very small sample of what's going on in terms of the M&A space. And those are opportunities as well. But these are companies that are out there hunting for deals, right? Because they know they need to do that. But there's all these other companies, these hundreds of other sort of, whether it's public or private, well-funded companies in China or Japan or Korea who actually need interesting things for their domestic or international expansion plans. And they don't even know where to look. So I wanted to give you another example of a product that is Chinese in flavor because it's not related to revenue, but also an area where I think a lot of collaboration will be, can happen in the future. And that is Cocos 2D X is game development, open source game development SDK. And for those of you who make games on iPhone or Android, know what this is. It is one of the most popular game development tools in the world. It also happens to be Chinese. But the origins of Cocos is interesting because it was actually developed by an Argentinian developer in a small place called Los Cocos, which is why it's called Cocos. And the Chinese company, Chukong, one of the largest game publishers in China, needed to have a development platform to not only reach out to developers, but actually to develop products for themselves as well as for a global marketplace as a developer tool. But it's open source, so they don't make any money from this. But they get benefit from the goodwill, and of course, maybe there's an interesting title that they can publish. Now, what's interesting here, I find, is that there's no revenue proposition directly. It's not an M&A scenario here, but it's essentially the fusion of sort of Chinese engineering and know-how together with an overseas component, combining to make a product that has a global impact. And I think this is where the next 10 years of opportunity will come from. Not that there's going to be a Chinese company that's going to sell you awesome products into the West, or Western companies selling you awesome products into the East, but rather the confluence of the two, the fusion, if you want to call it, between the best of what China or Asia has to offer and the best of what Europe or America has to offer. And that is something I think is worth encouraging. Now, quickly on some of the global startup ecosystems in Asia. There's many of them. These are just a few examples. But there's a lot of people who go to Hong Kong and Singapore, for instance, from overseas because English is easy to speak there. I mean, English is basically the official language in many cases. Whereas in Tokyo or Shanghai, you might need to know the local language a little better. However, it's friendly enough for people to just kind of move there. It's no longer limited by geography. And Hong Kong is a great example where, because it's only 45 minutes away from Shenzhen, which is essentially the maker center of the world, many people who are in the Internet of Things business come to Hong Kong, live there because it's a lifestyle they can handle, but then go to China basically to get their stuff made. And it's, again, only 45 minutes to an hour away. And an example in terms of the fast prototyping that's possible, there's multiple electronic malls in Shenzhen where you just go there and say, look, I want this phone that looks exactly like this. In a few hours, it's done. Your prototype is built on the fly. And this is probably one of the only places in the world where you can do that, which makes it very good for robotics or for any kind of hardware-related item. And of course, because Hong Kong is a financial center, it also ends up being a very good place for fintech. So each of the ecosystems out there have different benefits and different strength, which if you're looking to do business in this part of the world, you need to identify what that is before you go there. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future in terms of who are going to be the great tech companies of 2020. And I don't know whether these companies out there are going to be the big companies in 5 years down the road, since everything can just change in a year. But I think if you think about who are going to be the big tech companies that are going to influence your life, whether it's platforms that you exist on, or whether it is in M&A or acquisition or investment, you can see, and you can make a fair deduction, that many of them are going to come from Asia. And there's a fair chance that actually maybe more than half of them will be Asian. And how will you be able to take advantage of that in this changing landscape, where only 5 years ago, none of them were players in your field and had no impact? So if you wanted to create sort of, is there a chance that WeChat, which is a popular communication app in Asia, will actually come to the West? And in fact, in many ways, it's already happening, not because you're using it, but because they're in contact with all of their Asian diaspora, with their relatives from China or for relatives in Asia, where they're already communicating with each other through WeChat. And then it spreads that way. So are there opportunities for you to enter, to look at opportunities emerging from Asian companies? And since we're in Europe, I'm going to close with a few thoughts about why and how Europe could maybe play a hand here. From an Asian standpoint, or the Chinese or Japanese, we love Europe for your wine. It's a great place to be a tourist. But we know nothing about your tech, especially in internet consumer tech. We have no idea that you have amazing, cool technology that's available to partner with. It's all going to Silicon Valley, because that's what they see. Because they see that not only better at PR, they can see the products and the companies that are out there, right? And the investments that they're doing are not just in established companies that are big and large and have lots of revenues. They're in a lot of pre-revenue startups as well. But it's all moving, basically, west. It's not moving to Europe. Perhaps it should, because you have some amazing things to offer. But you need to let us know, because if you don't let us know, how can we know what to buy? And I think part of the loss is not just in the M&A and the financial side. Again, as I mentioned before, I think one of the great opportunities is going to be in the fusion of what's best of China or best of Japan mixed with what's best in Europe or best in America. And that fusion can only happen when people come together. And again, we're not as culturally divided as we used to be. But because we always think from before we're so far apart, we don't know each other, we don't get the culture, that has become almost too aggressive, too far away. We think of Asia as so far, or Asians for that matter, think of Europe as too unrelated, so we don't even want to enter. Very few Chinese tech and media companies actually are thinking about going into Europe for the same reason. And I think a lot of opportunity is lost because of that. And because both Asia is becoming more Western, and because the West is frankly becoming more Asian, there's more opportunity to be had. Thank you very much.